Ladies and gentlemen, we're ready to start, and very proud to introduce Dispensable Nation, Afghanistan after the US withdrawal. Mark Mazzetti, and moderating this session will be William Dalrymple. I'll quickly introduce William, who is, of course, very well known as a writer for several wonderful books, including my personal favorite of his, 9 Lives. He's won awards too numerous to mention, but I think most importantly, he's one of the co-directors of this festival, and I think he deserves a big hand. So over to you, William, and thanks to all of you for being here. And please try and maintain the peace, and we'll try and get questions to as many people as possible, but bear with us if we can't.
Welcome. I'm sorry for the cold weather. Next year we're going to move the festival forward a week or two, so you'll have to be complaining about the sun rather than the cold. Beyond our control, as they say. Also beyond our control is the loss, very sadly, of Vali Nasser, who was meant to be on this panel. His grandfather died and had to return to Washington. He was Richard Holbrooke's advisor for a long time and would have given a very interesting insight to the administration at that time. But we have instead, or not instead, but we have to my right, Barnett Rubin, who until 2 months ago was, like, you give the titles, I was going to wrong.
Well, I had the same position that Vali did, only he focused on Pakistan and I on Afghanistan.
Which was special advisor?
It was senior advisor to the special representative for Afghanistan and Pakistan in the State Department.
Which meant that you were effectively sort of seriously involved in policy making or policy just advising? Or?
No, both policy making and implementation.
And before that, of course, Barnett Rubin was and is a most distinguished academic on Pakistan and Afghanistan, has been an expert on the region for 30 years. Published a wonderful line of books, including most recently a great fat collected book of his essays, which I highly recommend, entitled
Afghanistan, very catchy title, Afghanistan from the Cold War through the War on Terror.
It's a big fat encyclopedic lump of excellent pieces, and anyone wanting a serious specialist take on the politics of the region over an extended period of time, highly recommended. Mark Mazzetti, to my left, New York Times, Pulitzer Prize winner, wrote an extraordinary book called The Way of the Knife. Some of you may have been to that session earlier on the increase of assassinations by the CIA and other agencies, and has been doing a lot of the New York Times reporting from the home front on the whole AFPAC mess. And Ben Anderson, who is both an author and a filmmaker, published an extraordinary book called No Worse Enemy out of his journeys in Afghanistan, going to very, very dangerous places I wouldn't even dare go anywhere near, and has returned just about intact. And when he's not in Ireland, is in and out of Afghanistan on a very regular basis. Subject to this session today is what is going to happen to Afghanistan after the American withdrawal. And perhaps the best thing to do would be to start with you, Barnett Rubin, and just say what the plan is, what is meant to be happening.
Well, thanks a lot. Before I get to that, I just want to thank you for the invitation. And something I neglected to tell you when you invited me, that I'm pleased to be back in Jaipur after 40 years. In the summer of 1974, I worked at the University of Jaipur on research, and I wrote a small book about the Sikher uprising against Maharaja of Jaipur. And I always remember the time that I was here because of one sentence on All India Radio, which could only have come at that time, which was, America ke Rashtrapati Richard M. Nixon ne apna tyag patra de diya. Which is, President of the United States Richard M. Nixon has submitted his resignation. So 1974, and it's good to be back. Now, on a much more somber note, I think first we have to recall that the other night there was a very serious terrorist attack in Kabul on the Taverna du Liban, the Lebanese restaurant, where any of us who were in Afghanistan as civilians and not as American diplomats who couldn't go there, now we see why, has eaten there. And 22 people were killed, and all of us know some of them. Particularly, I knew Vadim Nazarov of the United Nations mission there, a Russian diplomat who had served there for a long time, and ironically enough was working for reconciliation with the Taliban. The Taliban claimed that that attack was retribution for an attack that killed civilians in a region west of Kabul 2 days before. I, of course, don't know what happened in that area. President Karzai and his government have also charged that the international forces killed civilians during a raid in that area. And that is part of the ongoing tension between the U.S. and President Karzai. The attack, I would guess, was aimed not at revenge for that incident, because you can't organize such an attack in 2 days, but at intervening in a very important decision which is being made right now, which is whether there will be a long-term U.S.-led international presence in Afghanistan, especially one that led by the military. That is the subject of the negotiation on the bilateral security agreement, and it's the subject of decision-making in Washington. And the message of this attack was, there isn't going to be a long-term international presence because we won't allow it, and it will destabilize rather than stabilize Afghanistan. Now, there are, first thing, of course, is that no one, least of all me, knows what's going to happen, but I will try to outline some of the parameters. The official plan, as enunciated by the U.S. and Afghan governments, if they can reach agreement on this treaty, well, not a treaty, this agreement, is that the combat forces will leave. The Afghan National Security Forces will continue to be responsible for security. Those forces will be strengthened by the presence of U.S. and other international military advisors, a few thousand, and they will be paid for 100%, by the way, by billions of dollars in international aid. This in a country where the gross domestic product is about $16 or $17 billion a year. In addition, the social services and changes that have taken place will be continued: education, healthcare, rights of everyone, and women in particular. All of that, of course, also is funded by foreign aid. According to the official doctrine, that should be enough to secure the cities and the main roads. But in addition, of course, the United States and the Afghan government are committed to a peace process, often called reconciliation with the Taliban. I can say more about that later, which so far has stalled on numerous occasions, and I can say why. I have been involved with its being stalled. There's an attempt to get it going now, but I must say that at the moment, precisely because of the uncertainty about the balance of power in the future, no one knows if the Kabul government will collapse quickly or whether it will withstand the Taliban, and perhaps the Taliban will collapse one way or the other. There will have to be some kind of a test, unfortunately, a test in which the main victims, of course, will be Afghan civilians. This is the outcome is one thing that, however, let me put it this way. Here's my aphorism to sum up the paradox of the current situation. The changes that have occurred in Afghanistan are irreversible, and the changes that have occurred in Afghanistan are unsustainable. And both of those two things, I think, are clearly true. Now, that means we have to free our minds from simple dichotomies. Will it go on as it is, or will it go back to what it was? The answer to that question is no. Okay. Something new will happen. It won't be the same Taliban. It won't be, and it won't be the same Afghan elites. They have changed quite a bit. We don't know how they will react in a new situation. And it's not exactly the same Pakistan, and it's not exactly the same region. Now let me jump to somewhere else to show how different it was in 1989 when the Soviets left. In the past few years, I have been to China several times. And I don't know how many of you have been to the city of Shanghai in particular. When you go to Shanghai, one of the things you do as a tourist is take a cruise on the boat down the river. And on one side of the river is this fantastic financial district made of ultra-modern buildings, where, by the way, they filmed the recent Spike Jonze movie, Her, about artificial intelligence love affairs. Because it's that kind of a place. It's like Dubai times 10. But they will also tell you that in 1989, that was farmland. So when the Soviet Union withdrew from Afghanistan, China was an inward-looking, poor country, and concerned about threats coming into China, but not with much global concern. Today, China is increasingly a global power, global economy. India, similarly, not quite at the same scale, but similarly. This means that the regional powers are now realizing that they have to take more responsibility, and they have more of a capacity too. So, for instance, China has told Pakistan it does not want a Taliban government in Afghanistan. That doesn't change everything that's going on in Pakistan, but it puts some limits on their behavior. China is talking to India about Afghanistan now. There's an active regional process, which is something quite new.
You helped set that up, I believe, didn't you?
That would really be an overstatement. I've been in, I talk to people too, and everybody talks to everyone. But so it means that there are a lot of new factors. There's a power of attraction from the growth of the economies of China and in India, which means there's a potential for cooperation and an incentive to cooperation that didn't exist at that time. The threat that is facing us, however, is that there is a tremendous gap in the time it will take to put that cooperation together and overcome the tremendous obstacles to it, and the very quick changes that will take place with the withdrawal of foreign troops. Just finally, I just say a couple things. We can come back to them. I don't want to talk too long now. The most immediate threat to stability of Afghanistan in the next year will be a threat to stability, or the opposite, promise of stability, will be the result of the presidential election, the voting for which will take place in April. The election itself will start after the voting, because that's when the candidates will start negotiating about what the results mean. And if that election does lead to the selection of a president who is accepted as being the president, whether people like him or not, that will be very positive. If it doesn't, that will be an immediate shock. Then, further on, there'll be a military test of strength, and there'll be a political test of strength, especially in the relationship between Afghanistan and the donor countries, and the countries that have been supporting it militarily. And probably after the presidential election, the biggest risk will be whether Afghanistan continues to receive the kind of economic and political support which has enabled it to set up the kind of institutions that it has now. There's no doubt that that support will decrease. The question is, will it decrease in a manageable way or in a way that risks catastrophe?
Mark, you've been covering the home front. How committed and how much energy is the Obama administration putting into a safe withdrawal?
Well, first of all, let me echo what Barney said. It's a tremendous honor not only to be up on the stage with this panel, but in Jaipur. And let me say also that this is the most extraordinary audience I've ever seen. And that's not just a strategy so you don't ask tough questions. On your question about the level of interest, the level of energy, I think it's somewhat disheartening that you have to come to Jaipur to hear someone talk expansively about the American strategy, because you don't hear about it in Washington. And so it's too bad that Barney left government. No, I mean, and I say that actually, it's only partially a joke. There is there is a fatigue in Washington that I think echoes to some degree the fatigue in the United States about America's longest war. And there just is not, there are discussions, there are meetings at high levels in the government, but it is not, it does not appear to be on the high list of the priorities of the Obama administration, given everything else that they're dealing with in the foreign policy world. There is fatigue about the war. There is, needless to say, tremendous animosity about the Karzai government, about President Karzai. And for those who haven't, read William Dalrymple's piece in the Sunday New York Times Magazine about Karzai, which is terrific. And there is a, I mean, I wouldn't say the rush to the exits, but it is certainly a quick walk, I would say. You used to hear there would be the different camps in Washington and also in Kabul with the military, the CIA, the State Department, the White House. People would be advocating different positions. It's even in the military now, at the Pentagon, where you would hear the most vocal advocacy for a large presence, a sustained presence. Some of that energy is waning. The other thing I think
because they're pissed off with Karzai, or
pissed off with Karzai, I mean, they would like the security agreement signed. They would like to keep a presence, an American military presence in Afghanistan, but it's some of the positions you used to hear advocated by the Pentagon, you hear less now. And in the CIA, with the sort of general sort of reporting has been military relief. CIA will keep a large presence in Afghanistan to do what it does. I even get the sense that the CIA doesn't want to keep. I mean, they certainly will stay there. They will maintain a station, but they want to go do other things as well. They don't want to maintain a really large presence in Afghanistan because they feel that it's draining too much of their resources.
Would they be? I mean, Barney's already brought up China. I end my book, Return of a King, talking to a guy on a hillside at Gundamak, where the first Western incursion in the 19th century came to its bitter end. And the elder of the village said to me, "We are the crossroads of the world. We are at the victims of our neighbors. We do not have the strength to control our own destiny. These are the last days of America," he said. "Next, it will be China." And do you think the State Department and the policymakers would welcome increased Chinese presence as peacemakers? I mean, they've got mineral rights now. They've got interests in the country.
I think that I'd actually let Barney answer the question on whether they would welcome Chinese influence or not. I certainly see the influence of China, of India, of Pakistan. I mean, these big players will all remain very influential. They will all be backing their people in Afghanistan, and they will also be looking for economic opportunities. Barney, what would the State Department's view on Chinese involvement be?
Well, first, there's a kind of a public. The major image of U.S.-China relations in the media now is of conflict over issues in the South China Sea. But what is not so well known is that there is a convergence of interest in the areas to the west of China. And when China talks about expanding its activities in Afghanistan and Pakistan and South Asia, it does not frame them as competitive with the United States. It frames them as efforts at increased cooperation with the United States. And they're not mainly economically motivated. Their investments in Afghanistan are not really panning out in the short to medium term.
I went to that big mine at Mazzetti, and the Chinese, I mean, in a sense, did a very clever thing in Afghanistan. They didn't send in troops. They didn't spend money on bombs. They didn't send money in aid. They just bought the fucking minerals. and it makes sense. There's this huge mining operation at a place called Mazzetti, which has the largest copper deposit in the world.
Yes, but the Chinese are closing it down now.
This is what I'm saying. So they bought this thing. It's got a huge Buddhist Silk Route city underneath it. So the archaeologists have been allowed in. to try to excavate this thing. And when you go to see the excavations, you pass this enormous sort of prison camp-like thing that the Chinese have built. Miles and miles of barbed wire up in the hills. And these huge barrack-like prefab huts that they've erected for the miners. But it's on the main way from Logar province, through Logar province for the Taliban coming in. There's been a lot of violence in the area. It's become much, much more difficult even to reach from Kabul. The archaeologists have been kidnapped and this sort of thing. And the Chinese have not pressed the go button for the mine. Right. They bought it, they put up all the equipment, and the mine has not started.
I just add one point related to that I think is of particular interest to an Indian audience, which is when Will says the Taliban are coming in from, he didn't say where they're coming in from. They're coming in from Pakistan. Right. The Taliban, the Taliban who are going and attacking the Chinese mining activities in Logar province are coming from Pakistan. There are also militants from the Uyghur ethnic group in Western China, in Xinjiang province, who are also being trained in Pakistan and are going back to China. I'm not implying that China's internal ethnic problems are the results of externally trained terrorists. They are not. But of course, that greatly aggravates the situation. And China has found that Pakistan is not effectively stopping those people. So that has really affected China's attitude toward Pakistan, which is why, which it no longer considers as a reliable ally in South Asia and safeguarding its interests, which is one of the reasons that China-India relations have started to warm and that China is seeking cooperation with the United States in Afghanistan and with the Afghan government.
It's a crucial and vital change in the geopolitics of the region. Yeah. And it's something which I've read almost nothing about in the Indian press. I mean, it couldn't be more important to you guys. And it's going to change the way this whole balance of power in this part of the world. But you've been on the ground more than probably any of us in recent times in the really tricky areas to the south. People talk about a coming civil war. People talk about growing Taliban influence over wide ranges of Afghanistan. What is the situation on the ground now in the south?
I mean,
across the country?
It's surreal to travel to the contested provinces. Because I remember being there about a year ago in Sangin, which has probably claimed more casualties on all sides than any other town in Afghanistan. And there was a debate on op-ed about whether or not there will be a civil war after we leave. In the south, at least, there is a civil war now. And I was lying in my little cot in a little tent, firefights every day, IED strikes every day, casualties coming in every day. Almost all Afghan now, because the British and American troops just stay on the base, lifting weights, packing up their gear, going home. The training effort is almost over. In 2007, 2008, the British and American and Afghan troops used to live together 24 hours a day. And then maybe there's a chance of training them enough to take over once we leave. Because of the insider attacks, that training effort is over now. And advisors visit each patrol base for maybe 1 hour every few weeks and try and prevent the worst abuses. That's all they do.
What sort of quality have we got the police up to now? Because there were reports earlier of massive drug. I have myself been arrested by an Afghan policeman as high as a kite, pointing his gun at me and doing all sorts at 11 in the morning.
I think the training effort has achieved, and Barney, you were there at the time, but we've done what the warlords did after the Russians withdrew in the civil war. We've installed a force which make the Taliban look like the good guys again. Look like the guys who can supply security and justice. I mean, I was in Helmand recently and spent some time with the Afghan police force, and without exaggeration, they were kidnapping civilians for $3,000. They were on the police. They were doing heroin at checkpoints where they couldn't even stand up straight. They were selling the weapons and fuel that we were supplying them with. They were abducting and raping young boys, which is absolutely routine amongst the Afghan National Police. But 3 of these boys had been murdered while trying to escape. So I confronted the Afghan police commander responsible for the whole area, and his first response was, my men gave their asses when they were young boys, now they're collecting the debt that is owed to them. His second response, and I can't use the actual language, but you can imagine, he said, if my men don't have sex with those boys, what should they have sex with? The private parts of their own grandmothers. Pretty much justifying the abduction, rape and murder of young boys. That's what we've handed over to in Afghanistan, and that's why I think there is a civil war now to remove those government forces from the south of Afghanistan, and that has to play out over the next year or two.
You used the word justice, which is a very important thing. When you talk to, I've had so many conversations with ordinary Afghans about the Taliban, and they say that, yes, the Taliban were appalling in a whole variety of ways. We didn't like what they did to women, but they brought quick justice, and it was not corrupt justice. Do you think that's something you've heard a lot of? Do you think people do look to the Taliban as better?
It's a mistake to generalize about all Afghans, because what we're talking about now, and Sangin is a district in Helmand province in southwest Afghanistan, which is inhabited mainly by Pashtuns from the Durrani tribes. That is how I'm sure it appears to the people living in that rural area. That is not how the Taliban appeared to the people living in the urban areas, in particular in Kabul and Herat.
Or the north.
Well, that's a separate question, where they appeared as an alien backward force that reversed education and what relative freedoms the people had there, although they did end the civil war that was destroying the city. And there's an ethnic issue in Afghanistan. And it's a huge ethnic issue. It's so huge that people almost never talk about it. I spoke to one Tajik political figure who, mixing two English metaphors, said that it was the white elephant in the room. And because it's not an apartheid state or ethnic discriminatory state. The relations between the ethnic groups are not characterized by what we could call racism or anything like that. But there's a struggle for power and the struggle over patronage in a country that's one of the poorest countries in the world, high unemployment, high degree of insecurity. The Afghan state was built by the British. The deal was the Pashtuns couldn't come raid here anymore, which is what they used to do. So instead, they said, we'll give you enough weapons, money, and guns so that you can raid Turkestan. So part of what was of what is called Afghan Turkestan came under centralized Pashtun control, and the state used it to give land, water, and other benefits to Pashtuns who settled in those areas. And it continued, and a centralized government has continued to have that kind of redistributive function. One of the things that happened was
in my 1830s research, Dost Muhammad Khan, who was the first guy to really unify Afghanistan and who then took over after the British, he, as a young man, was sent as a Durrani Pashtun from the south, and he was made governor of the Uzbek areas around Bamiyan and so on. And his first act as governor was to invite all the Tajik nobles to a large feast, to place gunpowder underneath the dining room floor and to walk out in the middle of the dinner and blow the whole lot up. And this is the kind of generations of a massacre of the entire Tajik nobility. This was the kind of legacy. Also, a lot of slave trading. There was a lot of selling of the Tajiks into slavery in Bukhara and to the north. So very, very bitter, long memories of hatred and distrust across those communities.
And I should add that, so in the north, the Taliban appeared as a Pashtun military force that was using their retrograde interpretation of Sharia to re-centralize the Afghan state at the expense of the people who are living there, except, of course, they supported the Pashtuns who had settled in that area. Now, and in fact, that issue about the relative distribution of power among regions and ethnic groups in Afghanistan is a major issue in the presidential election, because there's a partial political settlement in Afghanistan between a kind of, let's use a shorthand, Western-oriented Pashtun elite led by President Karzai and the political military commanders of the non-Pashtuns, which is put together in the Bonn Agreement and the current constitution, and the different candidates represent different aspects of that. So different parts of that coalition, which they're trying to reach. Not blowing each other up and enslaving each other by any means. The Afghan political elite has worked a great deal to try to create a common national vision, it's very striking. I just want to say their degree of maturity and responsibility in this very difficult situation. But with so much international tension and so much dependence on the outside, I still don't know if they will be able to manage these tensions.
And I should just add, I agree that the Taliban are seen as a retrograde force in the north. The Afghan National Army in the south are seen as the Northern Alliance. And they make no secret of that. They turn up with pictures of Massoud and dust them on the windshields of their trucks, and they're seen by the southern Pashtuns as their former enemies who are coming for retribution. They regularly call them the thieves. So you don't even speak the same
language. Can you remember the figures? I think initially in the first years of Karzai's government, the army and the officer corps was something like 80% Northern Alliance. They've now whittled it down a little bit, and I think the officer corps is...
They whittled it down quite a bit. But it's not just the ethnic composition. Originally, there was no army, so the forces that were fighting the Taliban were then called the army. Then there was a struggle over whether those forces, who were mainly non-Pashtun, would be constituted into the army. And finally, that was won by the foreigners and the westernized Pashtuns, and they built a national army more or less from scratch. The officer corps is now significantly more diverse, but the only group within the officer corps that has a degree of social and political coherence is, in fact, those former commanders of the Northern Alliance. So, whereas the Pashtuns and other ethnic members of the officer corps who are there in significant numbers are there really as individuals. So that if they lost their funding or some other crisis occurred and the army split or collapsed, as has happened several times in Afghan history, please note I am not predicting that, but it is one scenario, then that would remain as a core armed force that would stick together probably, whereas the rest of the army would melt into the population.
Mark, how much effort now is going on in Washington to keep up contact with the Taliban? Is the back channel talks, is the front channel talks? What's the current state of play there?
Barney? No, it's, I mean, there are, as Barney likes to say, people talk all the time, and there is, my sense is still low-level discussions, but nothing approaching what was envisioned last summer when there was going to be official talks in Doha. Those who remember, the Taliban set up a political office in Doha. There was a big dispute over what they called themselves, and that was one reason that led to the collapse.
This is something that Barney has to say, because I think Barney personally took down the Taliban flag from the office, didn't you?
I personally photographed the flag being taken down. And the signs, yes.
Just to give a bit of context here. So,
and those were the pictures that the U.S. Embassy showed to President Karzai to show that we were on the same page.
So you were actually leading I believe, the efforts to bring the Taliban to the table. Would you like to talk a little bit about that? I don't know how much you can say.
Well, I wasn't leading them. One of the people who was leading them is here. Where is he? Michael Steiner, who is the German ambassador to India at the moment. I was on the staff of people in the U.S. government that were working on it. Let me see, the question is, what are these talks about and who participates in them?
Pick up your mic instantly.
I can't find it.
Hold it in your hand for a second.
Okay, check. Okay, everyone who can't hear me, raise your hand. Okay, no one raised it. The big obstacle, it isn't true that one side wants peace and the other doesn't. Everybody wants peace, which they define as their enemy surrendering. So everybody wants a political settlement. We're just, as George Bernard Shaw said, we're just talking about the terms. But there's a big question about what is the conflict about and who are the parties to the conflict. And the fact that the parties don't agree on that is the major reason that the talks have not even started. The Taliban believe that the conflict is between them and the United States, that the United States unjustly blamed them for 9/11, which they said they have nothing to do with, which, you know, they did have nothing to do with it directly, but they also did not turn over Osama bin Laden. We can, you know, that's something from a while ago. But the United States labeled them as terrorists and put them in detention with Al-Qaeda in Guantanamo. And they say, until we resolve the problem between us and the United States, there's no point in our talking to the Afghan government, so-called Afghan government, as they would say, or other Afghans, because the United States won't allow it, and they have some experience of that. So the Taliban first want to talk to the United States about getting prisoners out of Guantanamo, and the U.S. recognizing them as some kind of a legitimate force. That was what the office was all about. The U.S. position was at first, no, you are terrorists and we won't talk to you, and we will not let the Afghan government talk to your leaders so they can talk to lower level people. That policy was changed in the Obama administration, and it said, no, the Afghan government can talk to anyone, we will support that. The Taliban reached out, by the way, this process was started mainly by the Taliban, to the United States through Saudi Arabia, then through Germany and Qatar, to try to discuss those issues. But the United States position is that Afghans should talk to Afghans about the future of Afghanistan, meaning the Taliban should talk to the Afghan government. The Afghan government position is that the Afghan government, as the legitimate government, should organize a peace process and invite the Taliban. The Taliban's position is that the Taliban should organize the peace process from their office in Doha after the American. So far, there has been no agreement on who the parties to the conflict are, how they will sit together. So if we can, and it's a big if, I won't say that I am confident it will happen, but if the U.S. does agree to release prisoners from Guantanamo and some of these confidence-building measures go forward, it's possible that the basics for talks among Afghans will be laid, though there will again be a dispute over who chairs them, what the names at the table are. And I want to just add one other thing. Why is it so important what an office is called, or what it says about a name? Isn't this just arguing over words when people are dying?
I should maybe interject here, Barney, and say that it obviously matters a great deal to President Karzai. Yeah. When I had 8 hours with Karzai during Ramadan in July. One of the things he explicitly said is he said that you were plotting with the Taliban, Barney. How would you answer that?
Me personally?
You personally.
You didn't tell me that.
I did tell you that.
Well, look. I personally, this appeared in the Indian press as well. It's not about me, but I personally have never met any serving active members of the Taliban. I have met ex-Taliban. I was not part of the U.S. negotiation team. I don't know who is giving him this information.
I remain neutral with it, but
I know you're not giving it to him.
I never heard that Karzai ever would spin any kind of conspiracy theories.
And he doesn't do conspiracy.
But let's say, okay, it's painful to me that people would suspect me of doing that. But what it shows politically is the degree of mistrust that there is. And President Karzai also believes, and here he is right to some extent, that by maintaining control over military operations, detentions, detainees in Guantanamo and so on, the U.S. has not empowered him to start a peace process with the Taliban because he's not in control of the things that they're most interested in. So he sees a kind of collusion between the Taliban and the United States, which is not there in practice, in reality, and certainly not with me personally. And with Pakistan also, we have to always bring in Pakistan because the Taliban are based in Pakistan, and he believes that the U.S. and Pakistan are allies, something which the U.S. and Pakistan often find it difficult to believe. But President Karzai does believe that.
Do you think that he's, in a sense, just playing good poker, that he's, by distancing himself from the States, by raising the terms, by being difficult, by not signing the security agreement, he's simply trying to find a way to get the maximum out of the US? And there's no question that he's got... I had a conversation with the Representative Jim Dobbins, who said explicitly that Karzai was doing quite well with the negotiations. He was getting more out of the United States than the United States wanted to give. Do you think that's right?
No, it's true that is true. The question is, I don't know how many, I'm not sure what the status of poker is in India, or how familiar you are with that game, but there's a U.S. country western song about poker, which is, you got to know when to hold 'em, and you got to know when to fold 'em. So far, Karzai has shown that he knows when to hold 'em. I'm not sure he knows when to fold 'em, because I think he thinks his hand is much stronger than it actually may be, because he thinks that the United States is determined to have bases in Afghanistan in order to dominate the region. And as far as I can tell from being in the U.S. government, the United States has no such intention. The United States is concerned about lots of other regions and has other ways of dealing with it than having military bases in the most inhospitable, landlocked, electricity-deprived, waterless terrain in the world.
What is one point on Pakistan, because Barney, you have to keep coming back to that. I mean, one point I think that Karzai it could be right on is that all of this mistrust between Kabul and Washington, I think has had the effect, amazingly, to bring the United States and Pakistan closer together to realize that they are aligned on some issues. I mean, I've written a lot about how the relationship between the U.S. and Pakistan basically has been fraying over a decade, and reached a breaking point at one point. But I do think that the Pakistani and American government do realize that once the Americans leave, the U.S. and Pakistan will have a lot of common interests, if only to keep Afghanistan from falling apart. And so I think from his insular world, Karzai probably sees that as collusion, and they are all aligning against him.
He really believes it. I mean, I went away at him. You've heard the tapes, I think, of the conversations.
No, but I saw that kept in your story, yeah.
And 4 or 5 times he kept bringing up this notion of the deep state. He says that these ambassadors, they come from America, they're all very charming, they line up, and you guys, you British do, you all say one thing, and then something completely different happens on the ground. And he is convinced that there is a deep state in the US that is actively plotting with Pakistan to bring him down. And he seems genuinely to believe it.
Right, and I think that there is certainly, there are, as I said, there are elements at the senior levels of the American government where they realize the benefit of Pakistan, but it is delusional, I think, to say that the Americans and the Pakistanis all along have had this diabolical plan that they've never revealed to anyone over the last decade. It's if that's really going on, then they've hit it very well.
Ben, just again to bring it to reality on the ground again, when I first went to started researching Return of a King in 2009, you could more or less travel safely over the west of the country and the north of the country. You had to take trouble going southwards. Gradually, visit by visit, where you could visit seemed to restrict. You could only fly to Herat. You couldn't. You could initially drive to Bamiyan, then you had to take the plane. How much is the Taliban actually taken over already on the ground?
I think the provinces to the south and east of Kabul, they're in control of certainly the countryside. Helmand and Kandahar, they also, the major cities weren't under Taliban control. I was there just before Christmas. And What weren't? They're in control of the countryside, not the major population centres. The Taliban are now charging taxes in the bazaar in Lashkar, which was considered so safe that we nicknamed it Las Vegas, because it was the one bubble where the few officials that were in the south never left. So I think it will be a very short amount of time before they certainly take control of all of the Helmand and Kandahar and the provinces surrounding Kabul. And
what's happening in the north, as you move north from Kabul?
Well, there are provinces where the Taliban had no presence whatsoever, and there are fairly regular attacks there. I spoke to a group of interpreters who I'd worked with who live in Mazar-e-Sharif, who can't go there now because they've had death threats, because people have known that they're working as interpreters. They haven't got a strong presence there, but they are able to move freely there and launch attacks freely.
Again, a bit of 19th century history. Abdur Rahman Khan, in order to break up troublesome Pashtun groups, moved small groups of Pashtun into the far north of the country. So you have these little Pashtun centers which have become the kind of magnets for Taliban activity, and out of which, so places like the Wakhan corridor, which was completely safe to visit, and you had kids going trekking there and stuff only 2 years ago, is now, I think, more or less off limits for...
I think most of the restaurants in Kabul are now off limits for foreign officials. In the south, I was with an Afghan army commander who I spent a lot of time with when I returned to Kabul before Christmas. Since I was last with him on operations, he's lost 50% of his men, killed or injured. He says Helmand is a place to go where Afghan army or police go to die or be badly wounded.
So
he's being shelled every day by the Taliban.
There are figures, aren't there, for the casualties that the Afghan army are taking. The attrition is very high.
There were casualties, they're no longer being published, but it's certainly over 800 police and army being killed every month.
Are there enough police to sustain that?
No, a third of the force has to be replaced every year. I only know the figures for Helmand. In Helmand, the desertion rate is over 50%.
And yet, on the other side of things, then something that perhaps isn't reported much, the size of the cities in Afghanistan and the growth of the middle class. You've seen in places like Kabul the population increase by a factor of 5?
Yeah, well, any numbers are a bit questionable, but that's correct by order of magnitude. Afghanistan has been the most rapidly urbanizing country in Asia. As you know, the two things that urbanize people are war pushing them out of the countryside and money drawing them into the cities. And both of those things have been happening in Afghanistan for 35 years now, and particularly now, the money part of it is very big. But of course, it's not sustainable urbanization because it is dependent on the inflow of foreign money, which provides the jobs directly or indirectly for those people. So one potential threat which hasn't gotten much attention is the possibility of urban riots, which did occur actually in 2006, and which groups of young men belonging to the most staunchly anti-Taliban group in Afghanistan, namely people of Panjshir, marched through the streets of Kabul chanting anti-Western slogans, that is, slogans against the people who had helped them come to power. So, again, if those people lose their jobs in security companies and so on, their political leaders could mobilize them that way in a crisis. Again, I'm not predicting this, but I'm just saying that we shouldn't expect only those things we imagine or have been trained to look for will happen.
So in the last few minutes, maybe I could ask each of you in turn to be the kind of Mystic Meg moment, to look in your crystal balls and predict what you think is the most likely possible outcome. Ben, do you want to start?
First of all, just talking about the cities, every Afghan friend I've got, even in Kabul, has an exit plan. I don't believe the Taliban will take Kabul again, but every friend I have in Kabul has a plan and thinks it may happen. The future, I think, the best case scenario is the war that's going on ferociously, taking massive casualties every day now, continues until the Taliban control the southern provinces and the provinces to the south and east of Kabul and stick to that area, and there it stops. Worst case scenario is once that happens, the fight then continues and we see something getting close to the civil war we saw after the Russians, or 3 years after the Russians.
And can you envisage as a possibility a complete Taliban takeover of the country right back to...
I don't believe that will happen, but I think every single one of my Afghan friends I've spoken to over the last year or two does think there's a very realistic chance that could happen, and they're scared of that, and preparing for that as well.
Well, so there was a classified American intelligence assessment that leaked a couple of weeks ago about sort of predicting pretty dire circumstances in Afghanistan after an American military pullout, increasingly dire over the years. And now, CIA analysts tend to look on be on the pessimistic side. There's a line, Robert Gates, former CIA director now, and Pentagon chief who just wrote a book you may have heard about, famously said that CIA analysts, if they smell roses, they look around to see where the funeral is. And that is a sort of emblematic of the sort of CIA mindset. So you built that in, but at the same time, I do think, so more along of what Ben said, you would have increasing Taliban influence in the south, and maybe something of a takeover, it seems hard to, in my mind, to think that there would be a complete takeover or that Kabul would fall anytime soon. So it would be, but an increasingly fragmented Afghanistan in the future.
Well, I think the biggest variables that will determine that are not in Afghanistan. They're in the United States and in Pakistan. Because if the United States and therefore the rest of its allies and partners in Afghanistan do manage to continue some kind of a presence and maintain the levels of assistance for a few years, that will provide some breathing space for a political process potentially to take place. And if the civilian government in Pakistan if the government in Pakistan, which reportedly is the civilians and militaries are allied with this, succeeds in communicating to the Taliban that while they support their being part of a political settlement, they do not support their taking power by violence in Afghanistan. If the Taliban understand that they don't have the support of Pakistan to take power, then there's a chance that there will be space for the Afghans to reach some kind of a political settlement. I would say, and the differences among Afghans are not as great as the war situation makes them appear, in my opinion. However, there are any number of crises that could occur which would force people to make quick, sudden choices about their exit strategy, about their own security, such as a crisis over the elections, a drop in aid, other things I don't even want to speculate about. And there are very few shock absorbers there.
And just a quick point on the elections. The elections are absolutely key. They're already printing millions more registration cards than there are voters, and you can buy a voter registration card for $5 in Kabul now. So the signs for the elections are not good.
Barney, you opened this with Jaipur and India. Just to take it back to India at the very end before we throw it to questions, I don't know how many of you are aware of the incredible work that India has been doing in Afghanistan. India has been building roads, is building hospitals. Pakistani foreign minister I talked to last year regards it, of course, like all Pakistanis, as part of a big Indian plot to try and take over Afghanistan and to entrench Karzai in their interests. But there has been an incredible humanitarian aid going on, and India has given, I can't remember the figure, is it 5 billion or 5 billion? I can't remember, it's a huge sum of aid.
India is a member of the donor consortium in India, in Afghanistan.
Yeah. And I just had to ask you, Barney, just to close it, what do you think are the prospects for India in Afghanistan's future?
As far as I can tell, India is the most popular foreign country in Afghanistan. But Pakistan is the most influential foreign country in Afghanistan.
And the most hated.
And the most hated. And, well, very ambivalent feelings about Pakistan. I would say the Pakistani state is hated, but Pakistani society, parts of it, and Afghan society are highly integrated and interpenetrated. And there are millions of Afghans in Pakistan. So it means that, and of course, India does not have a current de facto border with Afghanistan, and its access depends really on its cooperation with Iran. So there's a limit to what India can do, but it's very important for, and here, India is not an obstacle to this, but one of the things we tried to do in our office in the U.S. government was to try to build some kind of India-Pakistan dialogue so that the threat perception that Pakistanis have about the Indian presence of Afghanistan is decreased. And actually, if I compare now to when I started in government 5 years ago, in fact, what we're hearing from Pakistan about the Indian presence is much less paranoid, much less alarmist, and more understanding that Afghanistan has a sovereign right to have its relations with India. Though, of course, there is a deep state in Pakistan as well, which maintains those concerns. So, but in conditions...
I should just say maybe that the Pakistani accusation is that India has these consulates in the south, in Jalalabad, in Herat, and in Kandahar.
That's not an accusation, that is a fact.
The accusation is that they're rural centers and they're stirring up trouble in Baluchistan.
Yes, well, just as I mentioned that there may be some terrorists going to Xinjiang from Pakistan. That's not the main reason that China has problems in Xinjiang. And I haven't seen any evidence of it, but even if, India has an intelligence, even if it is doing a tiny little bit with the Afghans, that's not the reason Pakistan has problems in Balochistan and in Fatah. That is scapegoating. But because if India's economy continues to grow and it continues to be integrated into the international arena, then India and China together, and I know that's a very bizarre phrase to utter in this country, could play an important role in stabilizing Afghanistan in their mutual interest. And bizarre as that phrase may appear to be, India and China have started to have a dialogue about that. That's not a substitute for as both of them would say, for the United States and the rest of the world community, but it will make other kinds of activity much more effective.
So, time now for a few questions. Hands up, microphone bells. Behind you, man with a hood on. We're walking away from him. Here he is. The hoodie.
Thank you for the excellent talk. You spoke about the potential decrease in money for the Afghan government and the resources, but I've not seen it in any discussions. Where's the money for the other side coming from, and how do you get that money to stop?
The funding for the Taliban?
Yeah, the funding for the Taliban. I mean, I read in War, the great book, people used to pay $5 to the local shepherds to take pot shots at the American troops there. Where's that $5 coming from? And how do you cut that off, obviously?
Taxation, protection money, opium. I might actually be doing a film next year where we propose buying Afghanistan's opium and turning it into painkiller, which is probably an absolute pipe dream, but would have the effects of cutting off funding for the corrupt government ministers and the Taliban, providing for the very poor farmers who are going to bear the brunt of, I think, what happens or what's happening now. And at the end of it, you'd have tons of painkiller, which you could give to the many countries that have a massive shortage of it.
And money from the Gulf?
It's always said, I don't know for certain, but it wouldn't surprise me in the slightest, yeah.
Well, the commanders on the ground, of course, if they control territory, as they do, then they also are able to tax the economic activities on that territory. And the biggest economic activities on the territory controlled by the Taliban are the American military operations. Okay, and particularly the transit of fuel, supplies, and so on. So levying taxes on the private security companies that are transporting goods for the military operation against the Taliban is one of the important sources of income for the Taliban on the ground. There are separate funding streams going to their leadership in exile in Pakistan, which is partly politically motivated donations from people in the Persian Gulf. But, and this again is a sign of how the region has changed, there is a very vibrant transnational business community that links Afghanistan, Pakistan, and the countries of the Persian Gulf. And the Taliban is integrated into that business community. And they have partnerships in various companies and so on. Many of the Taliban leaders who have established political offices or something like that in countries in the Persian Gulf are also involved in businesses. So it's not only illegal businesses, they're also involved in various forms of legal and semi-legal business.
And also this, and the other issue being the official or semi-official state support that the Taliban gets, or the Haqqani networks get, from parts of the ISI, parts of Pakistani military. There's all sorts of American intelligence reporting on this. Now, some of it, I think, does need to be taken with a grain of salt, but if you look specifically at the Haqqani network, there is certainly, seems to be a degree of continued support for the Haqqanis from at least parts of the ISI.
But the Pakistanis don't give them money. They don't have money. What they do is they allow them to engage in these money-making activities.
You had a very nice scoop in the New York Times about the security companies paying off the Taliban, and some of the security companies owned by members of the Karzai clan.
Wittan? Yes, right. Yeah. So the security companies, the Karzais. There's also the management. I brought up the Haqqani network earlier. There's all sorts of business arrangements, cross-border business arrangements that the Haqqanis have. It seems to me that the Haqqani network is more of a sort of gang membership that has sort of all sorts of business arrangements than
Al Capone is.
Yeah, there's the Sopranos, as opposed to a militant group like the Taliban that they are engaged in business activities cross-border, and that's where they are sort of see their future being.
But also the Taliban don't need much money. They're given food and accommodation by the local community, plastic water jugs, some fertilizer, a battery, 2 slices of a Coke can, which when connected go off. They really don't need much money, and that's why they could keep doing this for 10 years, and we can't, because it's costing us billions, while it's costing them almost nothing.
Thank you very much for the presentation. Just tacking on...
I think you need to turn on the mic and speak up.
Hello?
Yeah.
I'm just tacking on to what you were saying, Mr. Rubin, about the differences between the people of Afghanistan not perhaps being as great as the war makes them appear. I was just wondering, why are Hazaras hated so much? And do you think their lot will improve after the election?
Why are Hazaras what?
Hated so much, and they're fleeing into Quetta.
Well, I would dispute that Hazaras are hated. To explain, Hazaras are one of the 4 ethnic groups in Afghanistan that has a national political identity. There are lots of other smaller groups, and most of them are Shia. And so the main thing that distinguishes Hazara from, and Afghanistan is has been a strongly Sunni state. To some extent, sectarianism has been absorbed into the ethnic division, so the Hazaras are allied with the other non-Pashtun ethnicities who are Sunnis, so sectarianism recently hasn't been as big an issue. But, of course, at the time that Will was talking about in the 19th century, when centralizing absolutist monarchs were building a centralized state in Afghanistan, they conquered the area Hazaras lived, and they didn't consider them Muslims because they were Shia, and they enslaved them. Although I'm not saying they treated everyone else nicely, and that discrimination against Hazaras as being Shia and therefore not being even full subjects of Afghanistan, let alone citizens, is a historical fact. However, Hazaras have never had as good a situation in Afghanistan as they have today. The current constitution of Afghanistan makes Islam, not Sunni Islam of the Hanafi jurisprudence, the national state, and they are represented in the governing coalition. They still have many, and in addition, because many of them have gone to Iran, they got better educations than the people who went to Pakistan. And they are very prominent in telecommunications and media as well. And that has caused a certain amount of tension with other groups. But
one last question quickly. There's a man holding the paper up oh, you've got the mic there. No, you. Yeah, go for it.
My question is actually, political commentators find it really easy to call Afghanistan a failed state. How far do you agree that is the case with the ground realities that you guys have experienced?
I don't know what he said.
I couldn't hear that. Is Pakistan a failed state in 1 minute?
Afghanistan.
I'd say no. Pakistan is not a failed state. Pakistan still continues to function.
Well,
what?
Excuse
me. Afghanistan a failed state.
Mr. Dalrymple, may I? Yeah. Well, the United States seeks to establish peace in Afghanistan, and by talking to the good Taliban and by trying to make the Jirga a success. But at the same time, it is punishing whistleblowers like Bradley Manning, who brought the human rights violations into the public. Cannot one see this as the remnants of, early imperialism? Albeit soft imperialism?
Is the United States the new imperialist?
Well, actually his question was a bit more subtle than that. Sorry, jet lag. Okay. Look.
Yes or no?
Look, first, I just want to clarify something. The only people who talk about good and bad Taliban are people who are against talking to the Taliban. No one in the U.S. government or in the Afghan government has ever said anything about good and bad Taliban. Okay? We're at war with them. but that's why we need to talk peace with them. Now, as far as imperialism is concerned, the political, geographical structure of this region is the result of imperialism, right? A state in Delhi that has the writ all the way down to past the Vindhyas, the partition of India and Pakistan, the demarcation of Afghanistan by the British and the Russians, the fact that the U.S. is the only power that has a military with global reach, and we define its mission as stability, but we define stability as something as being in our interest. So I think that labels like failed state or imperialism are often an impediment to understanding, but certainly there is global asymmetry of power, and there is a struggle that is based on that, but it is not a simple two-sided struggle either.
No more time for questions, I'm afraid we're over time, but one optimistic note to end on. In the 10th row here, we have Francesca, who's just starting a Kabul Literary Festival. Kabul Lit Fest. So, when is it? There's microphone, quickly. Quick, up here, Francesca, stand up. This is the Jaipur's strangest child yet.
It's going to be October 2014, the first week of October. You're all welcome.
All welcome. Is it going to be free?
Of course.
Barnett Rubin, Mark Mazzetti, Ben Anderson, thank you very much. Thank you.
Thanks so